It triggers something in me that something has to be done.
For the Supreme Court, it's all about language, reasonable suspicion, objective reasonable belief, or probable cause.
There is a difference between states deciding how they want to regulate any number of things versus stripping people of their rights to self-defense.
Everybody has a right if they're a responsible adult.
3,000 people lost their lives in a single year, and the only thing standing between them and survival was a piece of legislation written 66 years ago that sounded perfectly reasonable on paper. What's happening in Nigeria right now isn't just a distant tragedy that Americans can ignore. It's a blueprint for what happens when governments convince citizens to surrender their ability to defend themselves while promising protection that never materializes. And the most disturbing part, the exact same people who praise Nigeria's firearms restrictions as common-sense gun laws are the ones pushing identical policies in the United States right now. Before we dive deeper into this, you need to understand why the pattern unfolding in West Africa should terrify anyone who values the Second Amendment. Because once you see how this actually plays out in real life, you'll never look at gun control proposals the same way again. Let's start with what's actually on the table from Washington right now, because this isn't political theater or empty rhetoric. The President of the United States has threatened to cut every single dollar of aid flowing to Nigeria and potentially deploy American military forces to intervene in what's become a full-scale crisis affecting Christian communities. Most Americans have no idea that the United States sent Nigeria over $1 billion in 2024 alone. That number has been climbing steadily every year since 2022, when American taxpayers were funding roughly $600 million in assistance. That money was supposedly allocated to stabilize the region, provide healthcare infrastructure, and support economic development. It was not intended to subsidize a government that systematically turns a blind eye while thousands of Christians face deadly violence on their own ancestral land. The president has the authority to cut that aid immediately without requiring congressional approval, and he can deploy troops for up to 60 days as long as he notifies Congress within 48 hours of the deployment. The real question isn't about presidential authority or legal mechanisms. The question is whether cutting financial assistance or sending soldiers will actually stop what has become a methodical campaign of violence that's been accelerating for over 2 decades. But here's the detail that reveals everything you need to know about what's been happening. Nigeria's government just publicly stated they would accept help from the United States to bring the situation under control. That response is essentially an admission that they weren't doing anything meaningful to stop it before international pressure started mounting. So what's actually enabling this crisis to continue year after year after year without any organized resistance from the communities being targeted? In 1959, Nigeria passed legislation called the Firearms Act on paper. When you first read the language, it sounds completely reasonable. Just basic firearms regulations designed to promote public safety, right? Except that law made it virtually impossible for ordinary Nigerian citizens to legally own or carry any firearm for personal or family defense. The licensing requirements are structured so that regular people can never meet the qualifications. You need police approval that mysteriously never gets granted. The restrictions are so severe and deliberately complex that farmers being attacked on their own property have absolutely zero legal pathway to defend themselves, their families, or their land. Meanwhile, the Nigerian government and military have unrestricted access to whatever weapons they need. And here's where it gets truly sinister. Illegal firearms are flooding into the hands of the extremist groups carrying out these attacks. So you have law-abiding Christian communities that followed the rules, surrendered their weapons, and trusted government promises of protection. And now those same communities are completely defenseless against heavily armed militias who obviously don't care about any Firearms Act or legal restrictions. Does this pattern sound familiar? Because this is precisely what gun rights advocates have been warning about in America for decades. Disarm the law-abiding population through legislation, criminals and extremists keep their weapons anyway, and innocent people start dying while politicians express concern and promise more laws. Let's discuss the actual scale of what's unfolding, because these aren't just statistics for academic debate. These are human beings who died begging for help that never arrived, who watched their families destroyed while waiting for protection their government promised but never delivered. Conservative estimates place the death toll at over 3,000 Christians killed in Nigeria just last year. But organizations operating on the ground believe the real number is substantially higher because countless deaths in remote rural areas never get officially reported, investigated, or counted in any government statistics. Since the year 2000, some credible estimates put the total death toll somewhere between 60,000 and 100,000 Christians killed in Nigeria alone. And this isn't random violence or spontaneous outbreaks of sectarian tension either. Approximately 70% of these deaths happen to farmers and their families who are systematically targeted for their land and natural resources, with their Christian faith being weaponized as the justification for the attacks. The pattern is predictable and methodical. Armed groups arrive at villages after dark, burn down entire communities, take the lives of the men, kidnap the women and children for trafficking or forced conversion, and the Nigerian government's response is functionally nothing. Maybe they issue a statement, maybe they promise an investigation, but concrete action, protection, justice, none of that materializes. But here's what should genuinely make your blood boil when you connect these dots. While this mass violence has been steadily accelerating in scale and brutality, American taxpayer money flowing to Nigeria has more than tripled over the past few years, and somehow the attacks just keep intensifying. The correlation is impossible to ignore. More American aid, worse outcomes for Christian communities. Either that money is being completely wasted through incompetence, or something far darker is happening with how those resources are being allocated and who's actually benefiting from them. Now, you might be thinking this is certainly tragic, but it's happening on another continent thousands of miles away. Why should American gun owners specifically be paying attention to Christians being killed in West Africa? Because the exact same people advocating for gun control in the United States constantly praise countries like Nigeria for having what they call common sense gun laws. They point to these strict firearms acts as the model we should adopt here in America, completely ignoring that those laws created the precise conditions that enabled mass killings to occur without resistance. Look at the global pattern that keeps repeating. Australia forced gun buybacks in 1996, and now citizens can't effectively defend themselves during home invasions, while politicians congratulate themselves on reduced gun deaths. The United Kingdom banned handguns in 1997, and knife crime exploded to epidemic levels because criminals understand that nobody's armed and the risk of armed resistance is zero. Nigeria restricted firearms in 1959, and now entire Christian communities are being systematically attacked with absolutely no ability to fight back or protect themselves. Every single time a government disarms its general population while maintaining weapons for itself and simultaneously failing to control illegal firearms, innocent people die in massive numbers and criminals operate with impunity. The Second Amendment wasn't created for hunting deer or recreational sports shooting at ranges. It exists to prevent exactly what's happening in Nigeria right now from ever occurring on American soil. And the uncomfortable truth that makes people squirm is that it absolutely could happen here if we allow our rights to be stripped away incrementally, piece by piece, restriction by restriction, until law-abiding citizens find themselves defenseless against threats their government either can't or won't address. Here's where this becomes deeply personal for many people, especially gun owners who've been culturally conditioned to believe that defending yourself or your family somehow makes you part of the violence problem. There's a growing narrative in America that good people shouldn't need firearms, that calling law enforcement is always sufficient, and that anyone who trains seriously for self-defense is either paranoid or actively looking for opportunities to use violence. This narrative sounds compassionate and civilized until you examine what happens when it becomes policy. When those Christian farmers in Nigeria were being attacked in the middle of the night, they couldn't call for help because police stations were hours away by terrible roads, and the government had already made it crystal clear through inaction that help wasn't coming. The average response time for rural police in Nigeria exceeds 3 hours. By the time any official response arrives, entire families have already perished, the village is burned to ash, and the attackers have disappeared back into territory they control. Even in major Nigerian cities, police response times average 45 minutes. And that's assuming they actually respond at all, which isn't guaranteed given corruption and resource constraints. Compare that to America, where the average police response time is 11 minutes nationally, which sounds reasonable until you realize that 11 minutes is an eternity when someone's breaking down your door. And in rural American communities, response times can stretch beyond 30 minutes easily. During that half hour, everything you care about can be destroyed, everyone you love can be harmed, and your own life can end while you wait for help that might arrive in time to document the crime scene but not prevent the crime itself. The uncomfortable truth that cuts across geographical boundaries is that whether you're in Nigeria or Nebraska, when someone's violently breaking into your home at 2 in the morning, you are your own first responder. You are the only person who can protect your family in those critical minutes before any official help arrives, and the idea that you should just comply, hide, and hope for the best while praying the criminals show mercy has gotten exponentially more people killed than firearms ever have. So let's connect all of this directly back to why this warning from Washington matters, and what it means for gun owners and citizens. Right here in the United States, what's happening in Nigeria is a functioning preview of what happens when governments successfully disarm populations while criminals, terrorists, and extremists keep their weapons through black markets and smuggling. Those Nigerian Christians aren't dying because they're bad people or because they chose the wrong religion. They're dying because their government systematically took away their ability to defend themselves through legislation that sounded reasonable, and then that same government refused to provide the protection it promised when it convinced people to surrender their weapons. Now American taxpayers are sending that same government over $1 billion annually while they allow the mass killings to accelerate. Meanwhile, critics who claim to care deeply about human rights and religious persecution stay completely silent about what's happening to Christians in Nigeria. That silence is deafening and reveals exactly where their actual priorities lie. But here's the part that should genuinely scare you about the direction of American policy. The same politicians pushing for red flag laws, magazine capacity limits, assault weapon bans, and universal background checks in America are the exact ones who publicly state that Nigeria's gun control framework is reasonable and responsible. They want to create the identical situation here where law-abiding Americans can't legally acquire firearms for protection while criminals have illegal guns flooding the streets through trafficking and theft. And just like in Nigeria, when the violence inevitably starts because criminals know the population is disarmed, the government won't actually protect you. They'll just tell you that you should have followed their laws, trusted the system, and waited for police who arrived too late. When those Christian farmers had their weapons taken away through the Firearms Act, they were told it was for public safety, that it would reduce violence, that the government would protect them. Those farmers trusted that promise. They complied with the law, they surrendered their ability to resist, and now their families are gone, their communities destroyed, and their land stolen. The government that promised protection failed completely, and the law that promised safety created the conditions for disaster. Whether it's extremist militias in West Africa or lawmakers in Washington, anyone attempting to systematically disarm a law-abiding population is setting the stage for innocent people to lose their lives while criminals and bad actors operate freely without fear of armed resistance. And that's not political opinion or ideological bias. That's observable historical pattern that repeats across cultures, continents, and political systems. Disarmament of good people enables violence against those same good people. It's that simple and that consistent. The average police response time in rural Nigeria is 3 hours. The average police response time in rural America is 30 minutes. But the average home invasion takes between 90 seconds and 5 minutes to complete. Do that math. In the time it takes for any official help to arrive, everything can be over. Your family can be harmed, your possessions stolen, your safety destroyed, and when seconds count, police are minutes or hours away. That's not criticism of law enforcement, that's basic logistics and geography. Officers can't teleport to your location. They have to travel there, and travel takes time. What's unfolding in Nigeria should serve as an urgent wake-up call for every American who believes in the fundamental right to self-defense. No matter where threats originate, whether from foreign terrorists or domestic criminals, if someone's attempting to disarm law-abiding citizens while making promises of government protection, the results are always the same. Innocent people lose their lives, families are destroyed, and the bad actors win because they face no armed resistance. Nigeria passed their Firearms Act in 1959 with promises that it would make society safer. 66 years later, between 60,000 and 100,000 Christians have been killed, with 3,000 dying just last year alone. The law didn't make Nigeria safer. It made an entire population defenseless against coordinated violence. And now American tax dollars are funding the same government that created this catastrophe through bad policy and worse execution. The pattern is clear once you're willing to see it. Gun control doesn't disarm criminals. It disarms victims. It doesn't prevent violence. It enables violence against defenseless populations, and it doesn't make society safer. It makes good people sitting ducks while bad people operate without fear. That's not theory. That's what's happening in Nigeria right now, funded partially by American taxpayers who have no idea their money is subsidizing a government that disarmed Christians and then failed to protect them. That's it for today, folks. See you in the next video.